So let's move on to the HTML now. So on this, again, on the Sites menu for the same page, we see that the HTML we're using is called Stens-Product Listing Page. And one thing that is important to point out here is that although HTML is linked to a piece of content or multiple pieces of content, it actually does have independent existence. So you don't have HTML as part of, for example, your .058 inner wire or your 1/7/8 hitch ball. You don't assign an individual HTML to each of these products. What you do is you create one set of HTML called Stens in this case Stens-Product Detail. They're both using the same one. That way, if you make a change to one piece of HTML, it changes it for both. In fact, on your site and in most cases, all the products use the same HTML. All the categories will use the same. So in J. Thomas, you've got your category listing page. You'll actually use the same HTML. Actually, that's an interesting example of J. Thomas, where you'd have a little bit of an exception to that rule. Just give me a moment. So as I was saying, products, you want every product to have the same look and feel. A product is a product is a product. On J. Thomas, however, you've got two different types of category landing pages. So for the engines category, it's actually a part of the hierarchy. It has child categories below it. And so when you look at this, you want to see a list of the categories below it. However, if you're looking at complete engines, it's a leaf category. It's at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so when you're looking at that, you want to see your actual products attached to it rather than a list of categories. So I can show you in the console. If we look at these two different categories for J. Thomas, one moment. We can see that these two have different HTML associated with it. One is J. Thomas product listing page, one is J. Thomas category listing page, and they actually have two different build entities associated as well. Product list with pricing versus subcategory list. So this shows you a way you can have two pieces of content which have the same content type. They're essentially the same thing, but get different behavior out of them because of specific criteria. In this case, we know that one's a leaf category versus one is an interior category. That's an exception, though, rather than the rule. In most cases, all products, for example, will have the same build entities and the same HTML. And I'll just show you quickly the way we set that is through the content type. So, okay, it's fine right now. We've got all these products set up on here. They got their HTML, they got their sites, their entities. We know how they're supposed to work. What happens when we add new content, a new product to the site? Well, we could manually set all those values, but by default what will happen is we'll take a look at the product content type, and all the information on the Sites tab for that content type will be pulled and will be used for any new item of that content type. So if I were to make a change here, it wouldn't do anything to the existing products on the site right now, but any new products coming in will use this information for determining how they're displayed. Any questions so far? Okay, so I'll go into more detail about the HTML itself. So in order to edit the HTML for a particular page, in this case we're looking at the search results page. It's the only page on the site that works like this. So if I were to, in this case, it is one-to-one the relationship between this HTML set and this piece of content. However, if you were working on a product or something that's where there's more than one of them on the site, again, be aware that any changes you make here will be replicated on all of those products. You can edit the HTML in two ways. You can click here where it says click here to view HTML, or you can click on this HTML button here. Our link here, it's really the same thing. Doesn't make a difference. So on any particular page or HTML set, you will have one or more HTML templates. And the way that works is you have one for the body or the header, and then one or more rows. For now, I'm just going to focus on if you have one row. I'm going to be talking about. Actually, I'll show you something which has more than one row momentarily. But okay, so I told you how build entity 1 brings back information display on the header. For the body template, this shows the HTML that's going to appear on the header. So this HTML here defines the look and feel of this up here. The store results, your selection, results returned, shows you where to put in the pagination, and so on. Depending on the page, even though we call it the header, it doesn't have to be at the top. You can embed the rows in the middle of the page, and maybe you want to put some stuff at the bottom. So in this example, again, we got some extra information down here. This is all part of the body template, and then we fit the rows in between. So this is more or less standard HTML, with a couple exceptions. The first exception being keyword replacements. So if you take a look here, you've got select order inside of 2 exclamation marks. So this is the Webfoot standard way of using a keyword. So in this case, select order is returned to the page by C# as a variable. Well, C# will pick that up. We'll have a specific value for it, and when it displays this HTML to the user, it'll replace that keyword with whatever value that keyword represents. In most cases, the ultimate source of that data will be SQL Server. So if your stored procedure returns a variable, a field called select order, that's the field. The data value from there is going to be plopped into here, and that's going to be what shows to the user. So you can do things like, obviously, just return a value to be embedded directly in the page. Sometimes we'll also do things like you could return a value which is a CSS class. You could return a value which represents maybe a Boolean value that you might want to use inside your JavaScript to control various client-side behaviors. So in this way, you can include your logic in the back end to actually determine certain things, certain changes, certain criteria that will cause the front end to behave differently. So let's say in this example you could have determine, okay, do I want to show the pagination interface here? Well, if you have less than 50 results, you don't want to. However, that's not something you can easily control directly in the database. So what you would do potentially is pass back the name of the class that you want to go on the pagination interface. So you could just have a class called hidden. You pass that back, it won't show up. Or if you know you do need it, you determine there's more than 50 results, you pass back an empty string or a different class, and the pagination shows up the way you want. Similarly, if you're going to use JavaScript to do something, you could use JavaScript to show or hide this. In that case, you could pass back a value and say a 1 if you want to display the pagination, or a 0 if you don't want to display it. And then you write some JavaScript which uses that keyword replacement as a variable. Because we stick that right in the JavaScript, when the page executes, it's going to use that value, and it's going to know whether or not to show or hide the pagination interface. So as I said, in most cases, the source of this data is the SQL Server. However, there are exceptions. In some cases, it could also come from a web service. So, we have a web service which determines freight, which determines taxes, and so on. As far as your HTML side of things goes, as far as what you put in here, you don't really care where that came from. You just put in your keyword, and C# will tell you what value to put in there. But on the back-end side of things, it can come from any number of places. As I said, mostly mostly the SQL Server, but it can also come from a web service. You also have access to query string variables. So anything up here, your content number, your search, your category, your brand, all those values are available to be used in the HTML template if you want it. So let's say, in our example, we have a little bit more complex way of determining what shows up in your breadcrumbs here. But something more simple, you maybe would want to just say your search, colon, and put what you search for. Well, you could pull that value directly out of the URL if you wanted to. And then there's some standard values which are always included. The content number is one of them, which is CN is the name of that. That's one you'll use almost all the time. There's a couple others for things like session ID and so on, site ID, but those are typically not really used on the front end. That being said, though, anything that the C# has access to that may be useful on the front end, it will pass back. Well, actually, we'll pass it to the front end. What it'll do is it'll replace those keywords in the HTML template and then pass the HTML template back with the keywords already replaced. So all of this is invisible to the user. It's invisible to the browser. When the browser receives this information, the source will already have those variables replaced by whatever data is coming from Webfoot. So yeah, this body HTML comes from build entity 1, and it'll only ever be displayed once on the page. So there's no way without actually duplicating your HTML, you could have this part displayed more than once. It'll just automatically show once, be populated with data coming back from the database, and that'll be it. If your query is well written, you will only ever return, well, you'll always return exactly one row for the header. If you don't return a row, you're going to get an error, and we'll talk about that more in the SQL section of training. If you return more than one row, it'll just use the first one, ignore everything else. In contrast, next we'll talk about rows. So in contrast, like I said, you can have multiple rows coming back from the database. And for every one that you would receive, C# will generate a set of HTML for that row. And that HTML is controlled by this template. So in this case, you got your item message. This could say something like out of stock, could say it's been replaced by another, this part's been replaced by another part, or this part is a replacement for another part. We want to know the new and discontinued status. We have the item number, unit measurement, so on, list price. All this information that will be displayed once for every product coming back from the database. If you have one row here, you'll display one. If you have 50, you'll display all 50. Otherwise, this behaves pretty much exactly the same as the header HTML. Now, one thing to point out is how you embed this. So we know we want to include these rows somewhere on the page, but you have to specify exactly where in the body you want to insert the HTML for the rows. And you do that very simply by using, let's see if I can find it, using this format right here. You just put rows and then /rows, and that will be replaced by the HTML for the row, for those rows. If you want, you can also put in something in between here. This Anything in between rows and slash rows will only be displayed on the page if nothing comes back from the rows. So, okay, you did a search, got no results. We'll display this because there's no HTML for the rows. So again, that leads me to just repeat what I said before. For body, you have exactly one row coming back. For rows, you can have any number, including 0. If it's 0, it causes different behavior on the header, but otherwise it doesn't cause an error, whereas a header that returns nothing will cause an error on the page. I just noticed down here, I want to point out what I had talked about before, where you can actually create JavaScript that uses some values from the SQL Server in order to control behavior. So, okay. For example, depending on your settings on your account, you may not have the ability to see the price, the list price. And so what we do is, based on this value, coming from the database ln hide price, we execute the store procedure and we perform specific functionality based on that.